I don't know how many people have had their lives turned upside down by a single phone call, but that's exactly what happened to me. It was a Wednesday night, sometime after 10 p.m., and I was sprawled on my couch binge-watching a show I had no real interest in. That's when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text or an email, it was my dad, David. He never called this late, so my stomach flipped before I even answered. "Kevin," his voice was shaky, like he'd just finished running a marathon, "I need your help. The business it's not good. Not good at all." I sat up so fast I knocked over my glass of water. "What do you mean, not good?" she asked, already feeling panic creeping in. "The contracts are falling through, the supplier is threatening to cut us off, and I think I made a mistake with one of the investors." His voice cracked and I could tell he was holding back tears. This was a guy who always seemed invincible to me, the kind of dad who'd patched up every scraped knee, fixed every problem, and carried our family through thick and thin. Hearing him like this hit me like a truck. Now, to give you some context, my dad's business wasn't some mom-and-pop operation. He ran a construction company that he built from the ground up over 25 years. David Grant and Company was worth over $3.5 million at its peak, but it sounded like that peak was far behind us. "How bad are we talking?" she asked, already bracing myself. "We are weeks, maybe days, away from going under," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Kevin." I didn't even hesitate. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said. Now, I wasn't exactly in the best place myself. I had just started a marketing job 6 months ago after bouncing between freelance gigs for years. I was finally getting stable, and while I wasn't rolling in cash, I had a solid apartment, a decent car, and a life that didn't feel like it was constantly on fire. But hearing my dad in that state, I couldn't just sit back. I called my boss, told him I had a family emergency, and booked the first flight back home. By noon the next day, I was standing in front of my dad's office. The first thing I noticed was how rundown it looked. The parking lot was half empty, and the sign that once gleamed with pride was now faded and cracked. It was like the building itself was reflecting the state of the business. Inside, things weren't any better. My dad's assistant, Claire, greeted me with a forced smile that didn't even come close to hiding the tension. "It's good to see you, Kevin," she said. "David's in his office." When I stepped into the office, my dad looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His usually sharp suit was wrinkled, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and there were bags under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises. "Kevin," he said, standing up and pulling me into a hug. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said, trying to sound confident, even though I had no idea what I was walking into. "Now, tell me everything." He motioned for me to sit, then started laying it all out. The business had been bleeding money for months. A series of bad decisions, some his, some out of his control, had left them in a hole so deep it seemed impossible to climb out. A few key clients had pulled their contracts, leaving them with unfinished projects and mounting debts. On top of that, the supplier he relied on for materials had raised their prices, and an investor he'd brought on to help had bailed at the worst possible time. By the time he finished, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "So what's the plan?" she asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's the thing," he said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't have one. I've been trying to patch things up as I go, but it's not enough. I don't know what to do, Kevin. I've never felt this lost." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. My dad had always been my rock, and seeing him like this was terrifying. But if there was one thing he'd taught me, it was that you don't give up, no matter how bad things get. "Okay," I said finally. "We are going to figure this out. Together." Over the next few days, I dove headfirst into the mess that was my dad's business. I went through financial reports, client lists, and contracts until my eyes were practically bleeding. It didn't take long to see just how bad things were. The debts were massive, the revenue was almost non-existent, and morale among the staff was at rock bottom. But I also started to see cracks of light through the darkness. There were still a few loyal clients who believed in the company and were willing to stick it out. There were projects that, if finished on time, could bring in enough cash to cover some of the debts. And there was one thing my dad had in spades, a reputation for doing quality work. The real challenge was going to be getting everyone else to believe that the business wasn't dead yet. And that's when I realized I had one advantage my dad didn't: I knew how to market. If I could convince the clients, suppliers, and even the staff that we had a plan, a real plan, we might just have a shot at turning this thing around. But then, just as I was starting to feel hopeful, Claire burst into the office with a look on her face that made my stomach drop. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "But the bank just called. They are freezing the company accounts." And just like that, the storm got even worse. I swear, hearing the words "the accounts are frozen" made my heart stop for a second. "What do you mean, frozen?" I asked Claire, trying to keep my voice calm, though my hands were gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. Claire glanced at my dad, who looked like someone had just pulled the rug out from under him. "Apparently, one of the creditors filed a claim," she explained. "The bank thinks the company's at risk of defaulting, so they froze the accounts until it's resolved. We can't touch a dime." I looked over at my dad. He was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at his desk. "Dad," I said, snapping him out of it. "How much is in the accounts right now?" "Barely $40,000, he said, his voice hollow. It wouldn't have lasted long anyway. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath us, but I wasn't about to let this be the end. "All right," I said, standing up. "Then we are going to figure out how to work without that money. Claire, call the bank and get me the name of the person handling the freeze. I want to talk to them directly." Claire nodded and rushed out of the room. My dad just looked at me like I was insane. "Kevin, this isn't a problem you can talk your way out of. The bank doesn't care about promises. They care about numbers." "Then we'll give them numbers," I said. "But first, we need a plan." Over the next few hours, I worked like a man possessed. I made a list of every possible angle we could take to keep the business running, even with the accounts frozen. First, we needed cash immediately. I figured if we could convince one or two of the loyal clients to pay up front for their projects, we'd have just enough to cover the most urgent expenses, materials, payroll, and keeping the lights on. Second, we had to cut costs. I hated the idea of laying anyone off, but there were a few subcontractors we'd been keeping on the books for jobs that weren't moving forward. I decided we'd pause their contracts and bring them back only when the projects were fully funded. Finally, I knew we needed to regain control of the narrative. My dad's reputation was the company's biggest asset, but word was spreading that we were in trouble, and rumors like that could sink a business. We had to show people that we weren't done yet, that we were still David Grant and Company, and we weren't going anywhere. By the time I finished writing it all down, it was almost midnight. I showed the plan to my dad, and to my surprise, he actually smiled for the first time in days. "You really think this will work?" he asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's better than doing nothing." The next morning, I got to work putting the plan into action. The first step was reaching out to the loyal clients. I called 3 of them personally: a real estate developer named Mark, a boutique hotel owner named Angela, and a tech entrepreneur named Raj. Mark was hesitant at first, but when I reminded him of the 6 projects my dad had completed for him over the past decade, all of them on time and under budget, he agreed to an upfront payment for the next phase of his current project. Angela was a harder sell, but I convinced her by offering a small discount if she paid upfront. Raj, thankfully, didn't even blink before agreeing. By the end of the day, we had just over $75,000 in upfront payments. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the business afloat for another month. Next, I tackled the issue with the bank. After a dozen phone calls and more hold music than I care to remember, I finally got through to the woman handling our case. Her name was Linda, and she sounded like someone who didn't take crap from anyone. "Mr. Grant," she said after I explained our situation, "the bank has a fiduciary responsibility to protect its interests. Your father's company has significant outstanding debts, and we've received multiple claims from creditors. Until those are resolved, our hands are tied." "Look," I said, trying to stay calm, "I get it. But freezing the accounts is only going to make things worse. If you give us even partial access, we can finish projects that will bring in the revenue we need to pay those debts." There was a long pause on her end. "I'll need to see a detailed plan," she said finally. "And proof that the company is still viable." I almost laughed at the irony. She wanted proof that we were viable, but the freeze was what was threatening to kill us. Still, I told her I'd get her the information she needed, and I hung up. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. I worked with Claire to pull together every financial document, project timeline, and client testimonial we could find. I even wrote a letter of support from one of our biggest clients, Mark, explaining how much he trusted us to deliver. Meanwhile, my dad started reaching out to his network of contacts, trying to drum up any new business leads. It was painful to watch him struggle, but it was also inspiring. He might have been beaten down, but he wasn't giving up. Then, just as things were starting to look like they might stabilize, the next curveball hit. Claire burst into the office again, this time looking more panicked than before. "Kevin," she said, "we've got a problem." "What now?" she asked, already bracing myself. "One of the subcontractors you let go, Eddie, is threatening to sue. He says we owe him $20,000 for a project he worked on last year." I groaned. The last thing we needed was a lawsuit. "Does he have a case?" "Maybe," she admitted. "The paperwork for that project is messy." "Great," I muttered. "Just what we need." It felt like we were playing whack-a-mole with disasters, and every time we fixed one problem, another popped up. But I wasn't about to let Eddie, or anyone else, sink us. I looked at my dad, who was rubbing his temples like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Dad," I said, "don't worry about this one. I'll handle it." "How?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said, standing up. "But I will." Eddie. Of all people, I didn't expect Eddie to be the one to kick us while we were down. My dad had worked with him for years, giving him opportunities on projects that most subcontractors only dreamed of. And now, he was threatening to sue us for $20,000. It felt like a betrayal, but I knew this wasn't personal for Eddie. He was desperate, just like we were. The first thing I did was dig into the paperwork for the project in question. It was a renovation job on a commercial property, and the records were, as Claire had warned, a mess. There were unpaid invoices, conflicting reports on hours worked, and even an email chain where Eddie had agreed to a partial payment schedule but never signed a formal agreement. It was the kind of sloppy bookkeeping that happens when a business is running on fumes, and it left us vulnerable. I knew two things for sure: we couldn't afford to pay Eddie $20,000, and we definitely couldn't afford to get tied up in a lawsuit. So I decided to try something bold. The next morning, I called Eddie directly. "Eddie, it's Kevin Grant," I said. There was a pause on the other end. "What do you want, Kevin?" he asked, his tone defensive. "I want to talk," I said. "Not as enemies, but as two guys trying to make things work. Can we meet in person?" Eddie sighed. "Fine," he said. "Tomorrow. My shop at 10. The next day, I walked into Eddie's small, cluttered office with a folder full of documents and my best attempt at looking confident. Eddie was sitting behind his desk, arms crossed, his face hard. "All right," he said. "You've got 10 minutes. "Fair enough," I said, sitting down. "Look, Eddie, I know things haven't been smooth lately. I've seen the paperwork, and I get why you're upset. But suing us isn't going to solve anything. Even if you win, the company's in such bad shape right now, you'll be at the back of a long line of creditors. By the time you see a dime, it won't even be worth it." He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was listening. "I'm not here to deny that we owe you," I continued. "But I am here to offer a solution. If you're willing to drop the lawsuit, I'll make sure you get paid, not just for what we owe you, but for future work. My dad's company is turning a corner, and when it does, I want you on board. You've been a big part of our success in the past, and I want you to be part of our comeback." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you so sure there's going to be a comeback?" I slid a document across the desk. It was the plan I'd put together for the bank, outlining how we were going to stabilize the company and start growing again. I'd spent hours refining it, making sure it was airtight. "This is how," I said. "We are already securing upfront payments from clients, cutting unnecessary costs, and renegotiating terms with our suppliers. The bank is reviewing this plan right now, and if they approve it, we'll get access to our accounts again. But we can't do it without people like you. Eddie studied the document for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "All right," he said. "I'll drop the lawsuit. But if you screw me over again, Kevin, I won't just sue, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows your dad's business is a sinking ship." "Fair enough," I said, extending my hand. He shook it, and just like that, one crisis was averted. But there was no time to celebrate. I still had to convince the bank to lift the freeze on our accounts. A week later, after countless back and forths with Linda from the bank, she finally agreed to meet with me in person. My dad and I drove to the branch together, both of us dressed in our sharpest suits. It felt like we were walking into a courtroom, and in a way, we were. Linda was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted us politely but didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Mr. Grant, Mr. Kevin Grant," she said, gesturing for us to sit. "I've reviewed your plan. It's solid, but I have to be honest, the bank is still concerned about the level of risk involved." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "I understand," I said. "But we've already started implementing the plan. We've secured upfront payments from clients, reduced overhead costs, and resolved a dispute with one of our subcontractors. Every step we've taken has been to ensure the business survives and thrives." Linda leaned back in her chair, studying us. "You make a compelling case," she said. "But the bank isn't in the business of taking chances." My dad, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Linda," he said, his voice steady, "I've been with this bank for over 20 years. You know my reputation. You know the kind of work we do. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove that we can turn this around." There was a long pause. Finally, Linda sighed. "All right," she said. "We'll lift the freeze, but only partially. You'll have limited access to the funds and we'll be monitoring every transaction. If there's any sign that things are getting worse, we'll freeze the accounts again immediately." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "That's all we need, a chance." As we walked out of the bank, my dad put a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Kevin," he said. "I don't know how, but you did it." I smiled, but I knew the fight wasn't over. We had a long way to go before we were out of the woods. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we had a real shot. Then, just as I was starting to feel hopeful, my phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Kevin," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to get back here. There's something you need to see." By the time I got back to the office, Claire was pacing the lobby like she was walking on hot coals. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping inside. She turned to me, her face pale. "It's bad, Kevin. Really bad. You need to see this." She led me into the conference room, where a stack of papers sat waiting on the table. My dad followed me in, looking just as confused as I felt. "Claire, what's all this?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed me the top sheet of paper. It was an invoice, one we'd supposedly paid months ago, but now there was a big red past due stamp across it. "This isn't right," I said, flipping to the next page. Then the next. And the next. Each one was worse than the last. Unpaid invoices, double charges, and worst of all, payments made to vendors we'd never even worked with. "What the hell is this?" she asked, my voice rising. Claire hesitated, then said, "I think someone's been siphoning money out of the company." My dad's face went pale. "That's impossible," he said. "I would have noticed." "Not if they were careful," Claire said. "Look at the dates. These transactions are small enough to fly under the radar, but over time, they've added up. We are talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, David." My head was spinning. The accounts were frozen, the company was drowning in debt, and now this. It felt like we were being hit from every angle. "Who would do this?" she asked. "And how did they get away with it for so long?" Claire hesitated again, and I could tell she didn't want to say what she was thinking. "I don't know for sure," she said finally. "But there's one name that keeps coming up in the records, Martin." Martin. My dad's longest-serving accountant and someone we'd trusted for years. "That's ridiculous," my dad said, shaking his head. "Martin's been with me since the beginning. He's like family. David, Claire said gently, I know it's hard to believe, but the evidence points to him. Look at the vendors on these invoices. They are fake companies, but the bank records show payments made to accounts under Martin's name. My dad looked like he'd just been punched in the gut. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I didn't know Martin well, but I'd seen him at company events over the years. He was a quiet, unassuming guy in his early 60s, the kind of person you'd never suspect of anything shady. But now, it seemed like he'd been quietly bleeding the company dry right under our noses. What do we do? I asked, breaking the silence. We confront him, Claire said. But carefully. If he's guilty, he's not going to admit it easily. And if he's innocent, well, we need to tread lightly. That afternoon, we called Martin into the office. He walked in with his usual calm demeanor, completely unaware of the storm waiting for him. Martin, my dad began, his voice strained, we need to talk about some discrepancies in the financial records. Martin frowned. Discrepancies, he repeated. Yes, I said, sliding the stack of papers across the table to him. These payments. They are tied to accounts in your name. Can you explain that? He picked up the papers, his face unreadable as he flipped through them. I don't know what this is, he said after a moment. But I didn't do it. You're saying these payments aren't yours, my dad pressed. I'm saying someone must have used my name, Martin said, his voice rising slightly. David, you know me. I would never do something like this. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the evidence was damning. Martin, if you're innocent, we'll figure it out, I said. But you have to help us. Who else had access to the accounts? He hesitated, then said, just me and Claire. Claire's head snapped up. Are you kidding me? She said. You're going to blame this on me now. I'm not blaming anyone, Martin said quickly. I'm just saying you had access to. The room erupted into chaos, with Claire and Martin shouting over each other while my dad sat there looking like he'd aged another 10 years. I had to raise my voice to get them to stop. Enough. I said. We are not going to solve this by pointing fingers. We need hard proof. That night, I stayed late at the office, poring over every financial record I could find. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Not only had Martin, or someone using his credentials, been siphoning money, but they'd also been covering their tracks by altering the books. It was a level of fraud that couldn't have been done by accident. Around midnight, I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of emails between Martin and someone named JG Consulting, which was one of the fake vendors. The emails were casual, almost friendly, and they discussed arranging payments and keeping things discreet. I printed the emails and brought them to my dad the next morning. He stared at them for a long time, his hands shaking. I can't believe this, he said finally. Martin, why? The next few days were a whirlwind. We reported the fraud to the authorities and fired Martin on the spot. It was a messy, painful process, but there was no other choice. In the meantime, I knew we couldn't let this derail us completely. The bank had agreed to lift the freeze on our accounts, and we had to make every dollar count. I threw myself into securing new contracts, renegotiating terms with suppliers, and reassuring the staff that the worst was behind us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over yet. Martin might have been the one siphoning money, but something about the emails bothered me. Who was JG Consulting? And why did it feel like this was bigger than just one man? After Martin was fired and the fraud was reported to the authorities, I thought the worst of it was behind us. The accounts were partially unfrozen, clients were starting to trust us again, and for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope. But deep down, something about those emails stuck with me. JG Consulting. It felt too deliberate, too calculated. Martin was meticulous, sure, but the way the fraud had been orchestrated made me wonder if he was working alone, or if he was just a piece of a bigger puzzle. So, one night after everyone had gone home, I sat at my dad's desk and started digging. I went back through the financial records, cross-referencing every transaction that mentioned JG Consulting. Then I looked at company directories, vendor lists, and even old project invoices. Finally, after hours of searching, I found something that made my stomach drop. JG Consulting was listed as a subcontractor on a project from 3 years ago, one we'd completed for a major tech client. But here's the kicker, the project's budget included a $150,000 payment to JG Consulting, which was marked as approved by management. My dad's signature was on the document. I froze. It didn't make sense. My dad would never approve something like this without knowing who he was dealing with. And if he had known, why hadn't he said anything? I needed answers. The next morning, I showed him the document. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice calm, "do you remember this?" He squinted at the paper, then shook his head. "No," he said. "I don't." "But that's my signature." "Exactly," I said. "So either you approved this without realizing it, or someone forged your signature." His face went pale. "Kevin, I swear to you, I didn't approve this." I believed him, but that only made things more confusing. If he hadn't signed off on it, who had? I decided to dig deeper into JG Consulting. A quick online search turned up almost nothing, no website, no physical address, just a generic LinkedIn profile with zero connections. It was clearly a shell company. But then I tried looking up the email domain that Martin had been using to communicate with JG Consulting, and that's when I hit gold. The domain was registered to someone named James Grayson. I didn't recognize the name at first, but when I mentioned it to Claire, her eyes widened. "James Grayson," she said. "He's the guy who tried to buy the company 2 years ago." My jaw dropped. I vaguely remembered the offer. Some corporate guy had approached my dad with a lowball bid for the company. My dad had laughed it off, saying, "I didn't build this from nothing just to sell it to someone who doesn't care about the work." But now, it all made sense. Grayson hadn't walked away empty-handed, he'd found another way in. This wasn't just fraud. It was sabotage. Grayson had been using Martin as his inside man, siphoning money and destabilizing the company so he could swoop in and buy it for pennies. The whole thing was a setup, and we'd fallen right into the trap. I told my dad everything, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the old fire in his eyes. "We are not letting him get away with this," he said. We called the police, updated the fraud report, and gave them everything we'd uncovered. Then we contacted our lawyer, who wasted no time filing a lawsuit against Grayson and his company. It was a long, grueling process, but the evidence was airtight. Between the emails, the forged signatures, and the fake vendor accounts, there was no way Grayson could talk his way out of it.